Hi there, my name is Lutz. The following presentation, titled Survival Needs a Cultural Change Right Now, is based on the assumption that humankind can be saved through a fundamental cultural change. The presentation is rather long, so do take breaks when it gets too much. The purpose of the slides is to underscore things. It is not necessary to look at them. Let me begin with a final word. Please ask yourself how your decisions and those of other people would be influenced if money, synonymous with the barter system, or charging each other, or system of return service, would no longer play a role at all, but if you merely had to act according to ecological, humanitarian, organizational, or technological aspects. Perhaps you might feel like a break right here. The survival of humankind is under threat because of various problems created by humans. Such problems are generally known, are only denied by people who cannot be taken seriously, and are so severe that most forms of life on Earth are under threat. Global warming, poisoning of nature, species extinction, famine, massive social inequality, war, atomic, biological and chemical weapons, as well as a never-ending production of plastic waste, for example. How could it come to this? And why are plans to save the planet, especially as they do exist, not put into action? In spite of the fact that empathy, solidarity and fairness is characteristic for human nature, as proven through neuroscientific research. In spite of the fact that humans are able to develop rationality and wisdom. In my opinion, the reason is a fundamental flaw in our current culture. This flaw either is the origin of the problems or a major obstacle for good solutions. I would describe this flaw as, let's say, the principle of charging each other. In our culture, this principle is materialized in form of money, but it also refers to the barter system or the system of return service in general. In this presentation, I would like to use the term our economic structure. Others have given this a lot of thought as well, but here comes what I think. With regard to our survival, I do not wish to put a stop to important measures which must take place within the current economic structure. I would like to develop a new culture simultaneously, which could be put into action when our economic structure is no longer able to solve our problems. From my point of view, the latter is inevitable. There is not much time left, but this crisis can force humankind to develop more wisdom. A great change is underway, which is a good thing. If we wise up, something great might be created. If we do not alter our ways, an apocalypse lies ahead, as described, for example, in the book Change by Graham Maxton, published in 2018. He is the former General Secretary of the Club of Rome. If you are not familiar with the Club of Rome, look it up. This apocalypse will occur within decades, if we do not act now. Before I start, I would like to mention two fundamental points of view. Please bear these points in mind while listening to the presentation. The first point of view is a meanwhile commonplace new type of locating errors. Human error occurs on the basis of systemic flaws. One could reply that all systems, be it technology, organization, education, for example, were initially created by humans, and that is why systemic flaws are also human errors. Yes, but as these errors often are based on cultural flaws, we often are unaware of them. For example, we have surrounded ourselves with technical systems which are not adapted to human nature, often leading to dramatic consequences. Traffic accidents, for example, prove this clearly. Such things occur because we haven't yet developed sufficient cultural knowledge to understand our human peculiarities and to correct our errors. Even if individuals try to act differently, it's often hard for them to act against the mainstream. For example, just try driving 30 kilometers per hour on all roads in town, and you will end up with a case of tinnitus because of sounding horns. You probably will not try it again. Well, this text is mainly about fundamental cultural misconceptions. The second point of view is my picture that the borderline between, let's say, good and bad exists within every human being, not between human beings. I do not wish to create the image of an enemy. Let's continue. Just put yourself in the shoes of Mother Nature. How would you control a species which is not controlled by any other, which expands ruthlessly and uses up all basic resources? You would possibly install an emergency brake into their brains, which would lead to a sort of self-regulation in case of perceived distress. I use the expression perceived distress because this does not necessarily mean an inevitable situation. A chosen framework can induce distress, which appears real, but, because the framework was chosen, is not necessarily inevitable. How does distress feel like? Distress occurs, for instance, if physical, psychological, or educational needs are not fulfilled. From my point of view, this emergency brake, this neurological program, has been subject to research for a while. It is the aggression. For this presentation, I am going to use the expression aggression, like generally used, in the sense of destructive aggression. Constructive forms of aggression, which are an important regulation, are explicitly not meant. Aggression is not an instinct, but an emergency program of the brain which becomes active when humans are subjected to pain or in case of social rejection. To be treated as an outcast activates the same brain regions as physical pain. An appropriate description of the research of such findings is outlined in the book Schmerzgrenze, in English Pain Barrier, by Joachim Bauer, published in 2011. I think it's permitted to carry out the following widening. First, aggression means all types of aggression, for example, not only the obvious aggression against oneself or other humans, but equally the aggression against other living creatures and nature. Another form of aggression is greed. A special form is structured aggression. In my opinion, aggressive structures develop from a variety of different types of aggression, which are projected from what triggered them in the first place towards other targets. This can happen over long periods of time. The intensity of the types of aggression within this process is not necessarily high. Therefore, aggressive structures are often not recognized and become part of the mainstream culture. Second, the emergency program aggression is not only activated by physical pain or social rejection, but also if physical or psychological needs in general are not fulfilled for a longer period of time. I will add to this point later on. I would like to clarify that I'm not talking about pathological disorders, such as antisocial disorders. This is a different subject altogether. By now, it is well known what causes antisocial disorders, which brain regions are affected, how they are affected, and how such disorders can be treated. This is good news, but in itself a different topic. Now I would like to ask you to do the following. Please search for Skinner box on the internet. If you cannot, let me explain briefly. It is a box into which laboratory animals are put and made to learn various types of behavior through a system of punishment and reward. Then, please watch a short video. Use the following phrase in your search engine. Highlights of the opening remarks from the 5th Conference on Self-Determination Theory. That was very long, but you can take a look at the slide. You will find the introductions of two contemporary psychologists, Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, at the opening of a congress regarding self-determination theory. Some of it will remind you of the Skinner box. Ryan speaks of a cage, and in addition, basic psychological needs are explained. To sum it up for those who are short of time, the basic psychological needs, as defined by Deci and Ryan, are relatedness, competence, and autonomy, which will be referred to later in the presentation. It might be a good idea to take a break now to think about some questions during the coming days. Question 1. Have we inadvertently created a kind of Skinner box in which our economic structure, via punishment and reward, triggers behavior that is characterized by a systemic disregard of basic human needs? The consequences would be perceived distress on a grand scale and therefore aggression on a grand scale. Question 2. Doesn't our brain offer different options suitable to deactivate this emergency response? Please note, it is possibly controversial whether the triggered emergency reaction is indeed aggression, or whether the definition of aggression on which this talk is based is entirely correct. Whatever way you look at it, it does not change the basis of my belief. Due to the economic structure we created ourselves, we trigger a neuronal emergency reaction on a grand scale, which endangers our very existence. Have you thought about this? Then we shall continue. I would answer these rhetorical questions with a decisive yes. We have indeed created a sort of Skinner box in which our economic structure, via punishment and reward, triggers behavior that is characterized by a systemic disregard of basic human needs. The consequences are perceived distress and aggression on a grand scale, which lead us to the brink of extinction. We have been doing this for so long that it seems like a natural law to us, but this is not so. Our brain provides other options. It is an immensely flexible organ and we can indeed deactivate this aggressive emergency reaction. We have to eliminate distress and relieve the pressure on our environment. In other words, we must achieve well-being for everyone and simultaneously reduce the intensity with which we burden our ecology. We must reduce the usage of natural resources, energy, photosynthetic capacity, and the production of air pollutants and waste. Short description of the photosynthetic capacity. Photosynthesis is the process which, among other products, produces oxygen, which human beings and most other organisms need to live. We have a limited supply of photosynthetic capacity on this planet. Humankind at present already uses the majority of this supply, for example for food production, but also with the spacious covering of natural surfaces. Jared Diamond refers to these facts in his book Collapse on pages 20 and 605, published in 2005. You might come to the conclusion that general well-being will lead to a further increase in world population and therefore to even higher damage of the environment. Jared Diamond writes in his book Collapse about this with regard to the development of peoples in history. But eliminating distress also means to eliminate a lack of education. Once people have access to education, the prospects alter. Thus, Rudolf Strahm wrote in 1985 in his book Warum sie so arm sind, in English, Why They Are Poor, on page 35, that an increase in social security was followed by increased birth control. Birth control programs are a form of education. Further on, he wrote that measures leading to reduced child mortality lessened the wish to produce many children over time. Checking the development of the population of various nations indicates that a higher status of living leads to a lower birth rate. Concerning Germany, you can confirm this on the homepage of the Statistisches Bundesamt, the Federal Bureau of Statistics. Achieving well-being for everyone in a maximum of consideration for the environment will reduce our number without violence. What tasks are we facing? We must repair ecological damage as far as possible and avoid further damage. For example, we must get carbon neutral, free the atmosphere on a grand scale of these emissions and store them safely. It is important that this mainly must be achieved by a reduction of CO2 emissions. Carbon capture and storage alone will not solve this problem. Other examples. We must free the oceans of waste and use these waste materials as resources. Environmentally friendly energy sources must become a standard requirement. Poisonous materials pollute life and environment and should be removed, etc. These are immense tasks, but can be achieved with modern technology. But who will be paying for it all? We will tackle this question later. What else? We must alter demographics. From a technological point of view, it shouldn't be a problem for a small portion of the population, in full or part-time employment, to care for an increasing number of unemployed people, be they pensioners or children. But who is to take care of the cost for such an alteration? What else? Clean water, good food, proper education, proper accommodation, In short, well-being for all, no problem. But how can we pay for it all? I'm convinced that all our most urgent problems can be resolved, but the most appropriate solutions are often beyond our financial capacity within our current economic structure. Regarding the question who should pay for it all, often a redistribution of money from rich people towards public welfare is being discussed. Even though this is necessary in the beginning, I have my doubts that this will be a workable concept in the long term. My question: how often in the history of mankind have there been attempts to make something good out of the principle of charging each other? The barter principle, the principle of return service. In our case, done via money for thousands of years. And how often have we achieved lasting success for all? Of course, these are rhetorical questions, as you realized, because the answer is clear. It has been tried over and over again, and some attempts have been quite efficient. But nothing has really been successful for all people, and nothing lasted. In my opinion, it failed at least partly due to greed. Money worsens the situation because it can be accumulated and is thus a means to further human greed. Otherwise, we would not be in such a critical situation. A further attempt is useless. Our economic structure has failed and is dead. And just to make one thing clear again, I'm not talking about capitalism alone. I'm talking about the principle of charging each other, the barter principle, the principle of return service. Dakota Indians have a saying: if your horse is dead, get off. Let's take a look at the costs. Let us first look at what Diamond and Maxton have to say. First, Mr. Maxton. From 2014 to 2018, he was the General Secretary of the Club of Rome. In 2018, he published a book titled Change. Among other topics, he refers to a report of a scientific team of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which appeared in 1972 under the now famous title The Limits of Growth. Sadly, this report is getting more and more relevant. The report is based on research of the team with regard to population development, food production, industrial production, the new use of non-renewable resources, and environmental damage. The report provides various scenarios concerning the future. Most of those will lead to global collapse, even if the prognosis would be based, for example, on unlimited resources. The only scenarios not leading to collapse were those in which good solutions for all 5 factors simultaneously were assumed. You can read up on this in Graham Maxton in his book Change, pages 13 and following. Jared Diamond, a professor at the University of California, describes 12 major problems created by humans in his work Collapse, published in 2005, on pages 599 and following. In my words: 1. The destruction of natural environments, mostly of forests, wetlands, coral reefs, and the bottom of the oceans. 2. Overfishing and overhunting of wild animals, which brings these species to the brink of extinction. 3. Species extinction in general. 4. soil erosion. 5. Burning fossil fuel. 6. Overuse of the freshwater reservoirs. 7. Overuse of the photosynthetic capacity of the planet. 8. Poisoning the natural environment. 9. Removing and reinstalling plants and animals from their native environment to other regions, often with devastating results for the environment. 10. Pollution of the atmosphere, a well-known topic. 11. Overpopulation. 12. High grade of interference with nature per capita and in general. It has to be stated that one person in an industrial nation has 32 times the ecological footprint compared to one person in developing nations. The grade of interference with nature will increase further as most developing countries aim to achieve the standard of living of the industrial nations. Diamond explains on page 612 that all these problems are interconnected and have to be solved simultaneously. None must be left out. This might remind you of what I mentioned earlier, quoting Graham Maxton's writing. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology reported in 1972 that a collapse was avoided only in those scenarios in which all problems concerned were solved simultaneously. Let me sum this up. We have a lot more problems than our CO2 emissions poisoning the atmosphere. CO2 certainly is the most urgent problem, but not the only one by any means. Let us talk about the costs. Only, if we consider the list of existentially threatening problems, we come to realize that in our economic structure, effective solutions will cost an enormous amount of money. The cost for the damage we cause at present is also mounting continuously. So let us look at some of those problems in detail. Maxton mentions on page 109 and following that the most urgent measures to protect the climate, we are merely talking about the climate now, will cost about 30 trillion euros within the next 2 decades. This refers to electrification, energy efficiency, isolation measures, and transition to renewable energies. Maxton admits that this is only the beginning, so that, for example, the cost for the closure of industries causing massive environmental damage has not been added, and that other expenditure necessary for our survival was not added. What is meant by the closure of industrial sectors causing massive environmental damage? Coal, oil, cement, car, air industries, for example. Let's take a short look on Germany's most important manufacturing industry, the car industry. According to Wikipedia, the German car industry has a turnover of roughly 350 billion euros per year, and it employs approximately 800,000 people. Its share of the gross domestic product is 3 to 4%. Means a loss of gross domestic product of 3 to 4% if the car industry is reduced to a possible necessary rest. The cost in social terms. Let's estimate an average income of 30,000 euros per year. This would lead to social follow-up costs of 24 billion euros per year. The follow-up costs for an alternative traffic concept have not been added. This only concerns Germany and only the car industry. A different example now. The area around Jakarta, the Indonesian capital, with a population of 32 million people, is sinking slowly. Mainly, according to the Deutschlandfunk on the 12th of October 2019, because it is built on swamps, and as more and more water is taken to supply drinking water, this leads to a lowering of the ground under the huge city. Another problem is the sea level rise due to global warming. Let us attempt to estimate the cost of resettling the population of this huge city. First of all, the old Jakarta area has to be cleaned up so that no further environmental damage can occur. For instance, petrol stations must be emptied, waste products of industries and households have to be removed in an environmentally friendly way. 32 million people would need new housing, infrastructure and employment. What would this cost? Let's estimate at least 10,000 euros per person. So the new city would cost 320 billion euros. And this is only the Jakarta area. The ecological cost for the place needed for the resettlement has not been included. Regarding coastal flooding, Kireschi and colleagues published a study in 2020 which contains, among others, the following scenarios. Even with ambitious reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, the number of people affected by coastal flooding could rise from up to 171 million today to up to 204 million by 2050. In this scenario, assets worth roughly 11 trillion US dollars would be under threat. In a worst-case scenario, 287 million people could be affected by 2100. In this scenario, assets worth roughly 14 trillion US dollars would be under threat, which would mean about 20% of the current global gross domestic product. In these scenarios, it is assumed that no further coastal protection would be installed. What does coastal protection cost? For instance, in the Netherlands. On the 13th of October 2008, the German newspaper Welt published the following figures on their homepage. The coastal protection the Netherlands have undertaken since centuries are worth about 2.5 trillion US dollars. Further protection due to climate change will cost 2 billion euros a year for the next 3 decades. So merely in the Netherlands, the additional costs would be 60 billion euros until the year 2050. Other examples for environmental damage and the cost incurred. In China, you can read it in Jared Diamond's book Collapse on page 455. The cost caused by one flood in 1996 amounted to 24 billion euros. The annual cost caused by damage such as drought, leading to deserts, and losses through water and air pollution are approximately 14% of the Chinese gross domestic product. Other sources mention 5 to 13%. In any case, it is immensely expensive. In between times, homework for the next coffee break. Try to repair a desert with money. If you cannot, assume that the real damage cannot be paid. Now, just take Germany. At the beginning of 2020, some East German and Bavarian areas experienced widespread drought. The media reported that the dryness extended to a depth of 1 meter and 80. Please try to imagine what costs would pile up if this would continue, and vast desalination plants would have to be built along the coast, so that water could be distributed across wide areas inland. With regard to watering, one must say that the simple spraying of desalinated water across wide areas can lead to salt damage, depending on the type of soil and the ways of cultivation. One method to do this right would be to put a short pipe to the roots of each plant. A great effort. You can read up on this method in Diamond's book on page 495. What would all this cost? Additionally, what would it cost to remove the continent of plastic waste which now floats on the oceans of the world, and to use this plastic waste as raw material? What would it cost to develop technologies and to use them to remove the microplastic parts, as well as other poisons, from the circles of life? Additionally, what will the corona pandemic cost? A pandemic caused by our disgraceful treatment of nature and its living creatures. Well, we now discussed a small part of the monetary cost. It seems impossible to foot the bill, let alone the total cost incurred through climate change and trying to deal with the consequences. Nor have we mentioned a solution in monetary ways for other existing problems. We also have to deal with demographics, for instance. If we manage to reduce our number and we then end up with a situation where a smaller number of employed people have to care for a greater number of non-employed people, children and the elderly, our current social system will collapse. Furthermore, how much would it cost to finally pay fair wages to child-caring mothers and fathers, carers in general, and other people in full or part-time employment? So far, we have not mentioned the cost for improving the situation of the poor, who are a major part of our human society. I would like to remind you that I mentioned to eliminate distress earlier on, and this is, in my opinion, a decisive aspect. In addition, the term distress covers many different aspects which will be explained later. So far, so good. In my opinion, the total cost for saving the world is unimaginably high in our economic structure. You might now be tempted to think about or discuss ways to somehow pay for all this. And that makes it more and more complicated, right? And in this way, we lose more and more time. But time is of the essence. It is urgent. Another question in between times. How do you open the Gordian knot? A rhetorical question, of course. The answer is, cut it. Did you notice how these thoughts keep you from taking care of important problems? While dealing with possible solutions, simply pay attention to the words cost and expensive. I believe that this is one reason why the existing plans to save our planet are not put into action. Because we are caught within our self-made economic structure. And that is why I think it is not superfluous to address this fundamental error in our current situation. This economic structure is not a law of nature. We made it ourselves and can also take it down again. If your horse is dead, get off. We must stop to charge each other. We have to replace our economic structure, currently based on money, with more reasonable regulations. These should cultivate our empathic and solidarity-based human characteristics. The time to change in this direction has come. How can we achieve this? Well, I do not have any fully developed solutions myself. It is not useful to present detailed proposals. But I would like to describe the cultural framework, which is important in my opinion. To fill a cultural framework with content is a collective task which must be shared by society with a high degree of autonomy. I am hopeful that positive methods can be found if the more than 7 billion of people on this planet use their imagination. We cannot disregard anyone. Each person is important. I would like to talk about some of the conditions with regard to the framework. We need some, not many, global, basic regulatory bodies, which should be based on the demands of Mother Nature and on the basic psychological and physical human needs. The individual should, however, be able to move freely within such regulatory conditions. This means the greatest possible freedom combined with the greatest chance of survival in the future. Examples for possible basic regulatory bodies are as follows, and some already exist. Charter 1. Declaration of the Rights of Nature. This you can find expressed very clearly in the so-called Earth Charter. If you have not yet read it, check the internet. There is a homepage. You will also find an interesting statement there. I quote, "When knowledge is limited, apply a precautionary approach." You could also call this principle caution. It is a noble attitude which has now been forgotten due to a mania of feasibility, profiteering, and claims of luxury. Charter 2. Declaration of Human Rights. I assume that this existing charter is generally known. Charter 3. Declaration of Rights and Duties of the Individual. For example, possession could be defined within this charter. In other words, what amount and type of possession can be accepted and which cannot. As well, which duties go with possession, etc. Also, the role of the individual for solutions required for everyday problems of the community should be defined here. Another topic regulated here could be the differentiated reward for different work intensities. This must be done with a reward which cannot be accumulated, for instance, with the differentiated working hour model. Charter 4. Declaration with regard to the breaking of rules. This could define how to deal with minor or major breaking of rules. The organization of the legislative, judiciary, and executive could be put into words. It is also possible to integrate existing legal systems into this declaration. Charter 5. Declaration of the Organization of Humankind. One could define the organizational units of humankind. In my point of view, these should ideally be mostly autonomous regions. The size of the regions should be defined by the local population. There is a need for national and global organizations, which will be in charge of regulating the cooperation of the regions. To a certain extent, such organizations also must be able to give orders to the regions, to set goals, and to make sure these goals are reached. We are talking, for example, about an acceptable level of CO2 emissions, acceptable degrees of ground sealing, etc. Scientific and expert advice could be defined as well within this charter. Regional tasks might also be formulated here. Military forces could be redefined in this context as well. I think the principle at the basis of it all should now be clear. The basis for living together on our planet could thus be: individuals do what they are able to do and receive what they need. Regarding all human activities, including activities which today mean payment or return service, only one question is important. Are the activities permitted by the framework I mentioned above? Karl Amary once demanded a redefinition of human work. In his opinion, this is nothing more and nothing less than a service within a solidarity-defined planetary community. The motivation for doing what one is able to do comes out of the fulfillment of what is needed. How do we define what is needed? We must, in my view, redefine well-being. We must do this by keeping our interference with nature as low as possible. How could this be done? In my opinion, we should remember what our true basic needs are. If we return to our physical as well as psychological basic needs, we might be able to redefine what well-being is all about, and, together with ecological technologies and ecological forms of organization, thus decouple interference with nature from our need to feel well. This means achieving well-being for everyone and simultaneously reducing our ecological footprint. Well, we know the physical needs: good food, clean water, good accommodation, good sleep, health, etc. It can be easily understood that aggression in all its different manifestations is triggered if such needs are not fulfilled. The basic psychological needs are less generally known. A basic psychological need is a need for certain life experiences, which, directly or indirectly, has its roots in certain congenital neuronal mechanisms. If such needs are not fulfilled over a long period of time, it will lead to a lack of well-being and to deteriorating health. Klaus Grave published a book titled Neuropsychotherapy, in English Neuropsychotherapy, in 2004, and defined the basic psychological needs in this way on pages 185 and 274. It can be concluded that not fulfilling basic psychological needs is just as damaging as not fulfilling basic physical needs. It seems logical that aggression is then triggered as well. If we consider greed a form of aggression, we might be able to explain various ways of behavior. Examples for basic psychological needs, as explained by Grave, DC, and Ryan. I would like to cite the video by DC and Ryan once again, which I recommended earlier. Ryan describes 3 basic psychological needs at the beginning of the video describing self-determination theory. First, relatedness. Good social relationships. This means not only to have these, but also provide one yourself. For DC and Ryan, these are relationships which encourage the development of human beings as by nature active and curious creatures. Grave also mentions the importance of positive social relations in early childhood. In this regard, research about fairness and equality are important as well. In 2010, Tricomi and colleagues found neurological correlates for an aversion to inequality in reward-related parts of the brain. It is interesting to see that the research also showed an aversion to advantageous inequality. The reward system was more active in rich test persons, when poor test persons received money from the researchers or from the rich test persons, rather than if the rich persons received money themselves. Kaplan and colleagues found out in 2014 that human beings differentiate between fair and unfair inequality. If someone, for instance, receives higher wages for more work he or she has done, this inequality is not felt to be unfair. In their 2012 research, Dawes and colleagues came to the conclusion that prosocial behavior based on equality is located in very old parts of the brain, just like breathing, the heartbeat, and the sensitivity to pain. Another interesting work on this research topic was published in 2019 by Wang and colleagues, titled Born for Fairness. The authors conclude that fairness is part of our genetic code. The second basic psychological need is, according to DC and Ryan, competence. Human beings want to contribute to the community they live in. They have a need to be effective and interact with their surroundings and have influence on the matters which are important to them. A third basic psychological need, also according to DC and Ryan, is autonomy. Autonomy means having the opportunity to make choices, means behavior that is self-initiated and congruent within oneself. When people are fully autonomous, they are wholeheartedly behind the things they are doing. This is different to being independent. I would describe this difference with, for instance, stopping at a red traffic light. If I stop at a red light, I obey a command from outside. So in that sense, I am not independent. But I can feel autonomous as I have integrated the reason for stopping at a red light, to avoid a collision, in my system of values. Important. In the video, Ryan does clearly state that autonomy and individuality are not one and the same, but that one can be autonomously individualistic as well as autonomously collectivistic. He also speaks about the difference between being autonomously means volitionally collectivistic and being heteronomously collectivistic. So from my point of view, our need for autonomy is strongly linked to our feeling of individuality and a rejection of ideologies which neglect individuality and force people to be collectivistic. Grave outlines the basic psychological needs somewhat differently, but it is obvious that many of his conclusions are in accordance with DC and Ryan. Grave describes an important aspect with regard to the changes we are facing: the basic psychological need for orientation and control. Orientation means to know what's going on around oneself. Control means to perceive things which are in accordance to one's goals. It sounds simple, but is in fact very complex, and much has been written about this topic. Let's leave it at that. I would like to point out one fact which has not been covered sufficiently by my previous explanations. I know a number of people who are free of destructive aggression with regard to interacting with others. In spite of this, these people at times take part in structured forms of destructive aggression. One example would be air travel. Our kind of air traffic represents an aggression against nature. So why do the above people take part in this type of aggression? I imagine that there are several reasons. There may be a lack of education or information. Most people simply do not know about the problem constant flying poses. And often people act against their better judgment. Maybe because taking part in structured forms of aggression is a kind of relief for suffered disregard of basic needs. With regard to ecology, many people might underestimate their role and feel that their behavior, even if it is basically unsound, cannot damage the planet. But we are many individuals, 7+ billion. And if these 7+ billion individuals behave badly, this has a great impact on our planet. Jared Diamond shows in his research of historic communities that in the past, groups of people destroyed stable ecological systems with primitive tools. Because of our advanced technology, the threat to our environment is far higher. In addition, this type of behavior may be caused by the so-called moral licensing. This is a psychological effect which describes that people who consider themselves morally sound have a higher risk for immoral types of behavior. With regard to this phenomenon, see also Joachim Bauer's book Schmerzgrenze, in English, Pain Barrier. As I mentioned earlier, it is also often difficult for an individual to live outside or against a mainstream. In my opinion, these aspects underline the necessity for a fundamental change of our current culture. Okay, should we name this new culture? To sum it all up once again, the barter principle, the principle of return service, the principle of charging each other should be abolished. Global frameworks to implement a set of rules based on the demands of Mother Nature and on basic human needs. Redefining well-being with regard to basic psychological and physical human needs. Reducing interference with nature. overcoming distress worldwide. It can be assumed that this new culture will deactivate the neuronal emergency program aggression on a grand scale. So what could we call this new culture? Perhaps we might call it the culture of planetary solidarity, quoting Karl Ameri. Solidarity among human beings, solidarity with nature and all living creatures, solidarity with our planet. And now you will ask how we can put this concept into action. What a difficult question. But we are 7+ billion people here with enough imagination. We simply have to dare to think in new and different ways. Possibly, we could use the United Nations to create a test region on the planet. In this test region, a research system should be implemented to evaluate and advise the project. People living in this region could organize their life autonomously within the new framework. Also, different transition scenarios could be tested there. The chances to implement such a test region are fair, considering the fundamental threats we are now facing. We could test this new culture of communal life and export the findings to other parts of the planet. Also, important global tasks could be started within this region. As I said already, this must be done simultaneously with problem solving within the existing economic structure. This will be it for the moment. Final word. Please ask yourself how your decisions and those of other people would be influenced if money, synonymous with the barter system or charging each other or system of return service, would no longer play a role at all, but if you merely had to act according to ecological, humanitarian, organizational, or technological aspects. Dare to think in new ways. It is urgent. Best wishes to us all. Thank you for participating. Lutz.